Judge Scorns black woman in court, then learns she's the new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. In a courtroom where justice is supposed to be blind, one judge believed he could wield his power unchecked until the day someone quietly walked into his courtroom, someone who would change everything. A woman, dismissed and underestimated, held a secret that would turn his entire world upside down. But how far does arrogance go before accountability strikes back? And what happens when karma walks in wearing the robes of justice itself? Stay tuned, because this story is filled with twists, drama, and a lesson that no one saw coming. The stately Franklin County Courthouse stood like an aging monarch, its sandstone facade weathered yet proud. Sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, casting elongated patterns on the marble floors. Inside, it was a typical morning in Courtroom 4B, a space imbued with an air of rigid authority that both inspired awe and bred discomfort. Judge Edgar Thorne presided, his black robe flowing with a self-assured grace as he took his seat behind the imposing oak bench. The gavel hit the sound block with a sharp crack, signaling the commencement of another trial. "Let's move this along," Judge Thorne said, his voice deep and slightly impatient. His words carried the weight of his reputation, firm, no nonsense, and to some, unkind. Attorneys and litigants straightened in their seats, as if his presence alone commanded their full attention. Among the small audience gathered in the gallery sat a woman who didn't quite blend in with the polished lawyers or the anxious plaintiffs. Her attire was sharp but unassuming, a tailored gray blazer paired with a simple blouse and black slacks. She held a leather-bound notebook in her lap, her pen poised, yet she wasn't taking notes. Her eyes, deep and observant, were fixed on the judge. This was Dr. Elena Ramos, a name that, for now, went unspoken in the courtroom. A civil case was on the docket, one that on the surface seemed mundane. The Jones family, a middle-aged black couple, was fighting to keep their modest home after a large development company claimed ownership of the property. At the opposing table sat a well-dressed corporate attorney, a man named Martin Vance, whose smugness was palpable. He leaned back in his chair with a faint smirk, occasionally glancing at the Joneses as if they were an inconvenience rather than a challenge. The Joneses' attorney, a young and earnest man named Damian Clark, stood to deliver his opening remarks. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady despite the immense pressure. "This case revolves around an unlawful attempt to seize property that rightfully belongs to my clients. The Joneses have lived on this land for over 2 decades. They've paid their taxes, maintained their home, and followed every legal requirement. The deed they hold is valid." Judge Thorne adjusted his glasses and frowned. "Let's not waste time with dramatics, Mr. Clark. Stick to the facts." The rebuke caused Damian to falter slightly, but he pressed on, producing documents that he argued proved his case. The Joneses sat quietly, their hands clasped tightly together. Their nervous glances darted toward the judge, who appeared more interested in the opposing counsel's arguments. When it was Martin Vance's turn to speak, he exuded confidence, as if the case were already decided in his favor. He painted a picture of the Joneses as negligent homeowners who had misunderstood their property rights. His tone was polite but condescending, a rhetorical weapon wielded with precision. Judge Thorne nodded along, asking clarifying questions that seemed to support Vance's arguments. He didn't bother to hide his skepticism when Damian attempted to interject with objections, most of which were overruled with little consideration. From her seat in the gallery, Elena's jaw tightened. She could see the imbalance clearly. The judge's dismissive attitude toward Damian's objections, the way his gaze lingered on Martin with approval. It was subtle but unmistakable. She scribbled something in her notebook and continued to watch. During a recess, the courtroom emptied except for a few individuals. Elena remained seated, quietly reviewing her notes. Damian Clark approached her, visibly frustrated but polite. "I couldn't help but notice you taking notes," he said. "Are you with the press?" "No," Elena replied, her tone neutral. "Just observing." Before Damian could ask more, Judge Thorne entered, his robe billowing as he strode back toward the bench. He noticed the interaction and frowned. "This isn't a cafe," he said brusquely, addressing Elena. "If you're not a lawyer, you shouldn't be distracting my court officers." Elena turned to him, her expression calm but unwavering. "I'm not distracting anyone, Your Honor." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "Well then, unless you have business here, I suggest you leave the gallery." We don't have time for spectators. I'll remain seated. Thank you, she replied, her tone as composed as ever. The judge's face flushed with irritation. You're testing my patience, he snapped. This is my courtroom, and I decide who stays and who goes. The tension was palpable, and a few attorneys who overheard the exchange glanced uneasily in their direction. Elena met his gaze without flinching. Understood, Your Honor. I assure you I'll stay within the bounds of your rules. Judge Thorne muttered something under his breath before returning to his chambers. Damien, standing nearby, whispered, You handled that better than most would. I don't know who you are, but you've got nerve. Elena smiled faintly but didn't respond. As the recess ended, Elena remained seated, her presence now a quiet statement of defiance. Judge Thorne returned to the bench, his expression harder than before. The trial resumed, but a sense of unease lingered in the room, as though the balance of power had subtly shifted. Elena's pen resumed its quiet work, capturing every detail, every misstep. Judge Thorne had no idea who she was yet. The courtroom clock ticked steadily, its rhythmic sound a subtle reminder of the passing hours. Judge Edgar Thorne sat with his hands folded neatly on the bench, his expression a mask of practiced neutrality, though his earlier confrontation with the woman in the gallery had left him unsettled. She remained seated, her posture composed, her presence impossible to ignore. Proceed, Thorne ordered, gesturing to Martin Vance with a curt nod. Martin Vance rose confidently, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor as he approached the center of the courtroom. His tailored suit and perfect posture spoke of a man used to winning, someone who had little doubt about the outcome of this trial. He carried a thick folder, which he held like a weapon. Your Honor, Martin began, his tone smooth. The evidence is clear. The Joneses' claim to the property is based on an outdated deed that no longer holds legal standing. My client, Greenway Investments, acquired the land through proper channels. He handed a copy of the supposed deed transfer to the bailiff, who placed it before Judge Thorne. The judge adjusted his glasses, scanning the document. He muttered, nodding slightly. Mr. Vance, this appears to be in order. Across the courtroom, Damien Clark's jaw tightened. He quickly rose. Your Honor, if I may, the document submitted by the opposing counsel is not authenticated. We believe this deed is fraudulent. Martin Vance chuckled softly, a sound that rippled through the quiet courtroom. Fraudulent? That's a strong accusation, Counselor. I trust you have evidence to support such a claim. Damien stepped forward, holding up his own stack of papers. We have the original deed, signed and notarized 25 years ago, as well as tax records showing consistent payments made by the Joneses during that time. The Joneses sat behind their attorney, clutching each other's hands. Mrs. Jones's eyes brimmed with unshed tears, while her husband's expression was one of quiet fury. Judge Thorne waved his hand dismissively. Let me see those documents. As the judge flipped through the Joneses' evidence, his expression soured. He set the papers down with an audible sigh. While these documents do indicate ownership at one time, Thorne said, his tone sharp, they don't necessarily prove that the Joneses have a current, valid claim. Mr. Vance's deed appears more recent and therefore more relevant. Damien blinked in disbelief. Your Honor, with all due respect, these documents clearly establish. Thorne cut him off with a sharp rap of his gavel. Counselor, you're testing my patience. Unless you have irrefutable proof of fraud, I suggest you move on. From the gallery, Elena Ramos observed the exchange intently. Her pen moved methodically across the pages of her notebook. Every detail was recorded. Thorne's dismissive tone, the way he leaned slightly toward Martin Vance, and his tendency to cut off Damien mid-sentence. She noticed how Thorne barely glanced at the Joneses, as though their presence was an afterthought in his courtroom. It was a pattern she'd seen before, a pattern she knew all too well. The recess bell rang again, signaling another break in the proceedings. The courtroom emptied, leaving only a few stragglers behind. Damien approached the Joneses, crouching beside them to reassure them quietly. Elena remained in her seat, flipping through her notes. She had seen enough to confirm what she had suspected. This was more than a simple case of judicial oversight. This was bias in action, subtle yet insidious. Excuse me. A voice interrupted her thoughts. Elena looked up to find Martin Vance standing before her, his smirk firmly in place. He held a styrofoam cup of coffee in one hand and gestured toward her notebook with the other. You're taking a lot of notes for someone who isn't involved in the case, he said, his tone equal parts curiosity and condescension. Elena didn't flinch. I find it helpful to document proceedings. Keeps me sharp. Vance chuckled. Well, I hope you're enjoying the show, though I have to say, it's not much of a contest, is it? Judge Thorne knows a solid argument when he sees one. Her gaze didn't waver. A solid argument, she repeated, her voice calm. Or a convenient one? The smirk faltered for just a moment before he regained his composure. Have a good day, he said, tipping his cup slightly before walking away. Minutes later, Judge Thorne entered the courtroom early, his robe flowing as he moved toward the bench. He paused when he saw Elena still seated in the gallery. Still here, he said, his voice tinged with irritation. I am, she replied simply. Thorne stared at her for a moment, his brow furrowing. There was something about her presence that unsettled him. He couldn't quite place it. Her confidence, her unflinching demeanor. But it irked him nonetheless. This isn't a public forum for debate, he said, his tone clipped. If you're here to criticize how I run my court, you're wasting your time. Elena closed her notebook and stood. For a moment, it seemed she might leave, but instead, she walked closer to the bench, stopping just short of crossing the line between the gallery and the well of the court. I'm not here to criticize, Your Honor, she said evenly. I'm here to observe. Thorne opened his mouth to respond, but something in her tone silenced him. Without another word, he turned and retreated to his chambers. As the courtroom filled once more, Elena returned to her seat. The Joneses and their attorney filed in, their faces a mixture of hope and dread. Judge Thorne took his place at the bench, but his earlier confidence seemed slightly diminished. He glanced at Elena once, quickly, before refocusing on the trial. She knew the moment of truth was approaching. The cracks in Thorne's authority were beginning to show, and soon the weight of his arrogance would bring the entire facade crumbling down. The courtroom resumed its rhythm as the recess ended, but an unspoken tension filled the air. The gavel fell once more, the sharp crack echoing off the high ceilings, commanding silence. Judge Thorne adjusted his robe, leaning slightly forward in his chair as if to reassert control over the proceedings. His gaze swept across the room, briefly landing on Elena Ramos, who sat unmoving, her notebook open in her lap. Something about her composure unsettled him, but he quickly shifted his focus back to the trial. Mr. Clark, Thorne said, his voice carrying a hint of weariness. If you have no new evidence to present, I suggest we move to closing arguments. Damian Clark rose to his feet, his movement stiff with tension. He had been fighting this case for weeks, and it was clear the odds were stacked against him. Yet there was a spark of determination in his eyes. Your Honor, Damian began, his voice steady despite the pressure. Before we proceed, I would like to reiterate the significance of the original deed and tax records we presented. They clearly demonstrate that the Joneses are the rightful owners of the property in question. Thorne sighed audibly, leaning back in his chair. Mr. Clark, we've been over this. The documents may indicate past ownership, but they do not account for the present circumstances. Unless you have irrefutable proof of fraud, your argument lacks merit. Damian hesitated, his grip tightening on the edges of his papers. Your Honor, I believe the court has an obligation to thoroughly examine the authenticity of the opposing counsel's deed. Without verification, we risk— Thorne cut him off with a wave of his hand. Enough, counselor. I've made my position clear. At the plaintiff's table, the Joneses sat quietly, their shoulders hunched under the weight of the judge's words. Mrs. Jones's hands were clenched in her lap, her knuckles white, while Mr. Jones stared down at the table, his jaw tight with suppressed anger. From her seat in the gallery, Elena observed their pain with a heavy heart. She had seen this pattern before. People of power dismissing those without it, assuming their voices didn't matter. Her pen moved steadily across the page, documenting every moment. As Martin Vance rose to deliver his closing remarks, Elena shifted slightly in her seat. Her movement caught Thorne's eye, and for a brief moment, their gazes locked. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but it quickly passed. He dismissed her presence as unimportant. Your Honor, Martin began, his voice smooth and confident. The facts speak for themselves. My client has followed all legal protocols, and the deed we've submitted is both valid and binding. The Joneses' claim, while unfortunate, simply doesn't hold up under scrutiny. His words were calculated, designed to appeal to Thorne's apparent bias. The judge nodded along, his expression one of agreement. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," Thorne said. "Your argument is well-reasoned and supported by the evidence." As Vance returned to his seat, Elena stood. The movement was so unexpected that all eyes in the room turned to her. "Excuse me, Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but firm. "May I speak?" Thorne frowned, his irritation visible. "And you are?" "Elena Ramos," she replied simply, not offering any further details. Thorne's frown deepened. "This is highly irregular, Miss Ramos. Unless you're an attorney or a party to the case, you have no standing to address this court." Elena stepped forward, stopping just short of the dividing line between the gallery and the well of the court. Her presence commanded attention, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Thorne's rising irritation. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "I believe the integrity of this court is at stake. As an observer, I've noted several procedural irregularities that warrant further examination." Thorne's face flushed. "This is my courtroom, and I decide what warrants examination. If you continue to disrupt these proceedings, I will have you removed." Elena didn't flinch. "Understood, Your Honor. I'll remain seated." As Elena returned to her seat, the tension in the room was palpable. Damien glanced at her, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes, though he remained silent. The Joneses exchanged a look, their expressions a mixture of confusion and hope. Thorne, visibly unsettled, tried to refocus on the trial. "We will now proceed to my ruling." Thorne cleared his throat, shuffling the papers before him. "After reviewing the evidence presented, I find in favor of Greenway Investments. The plaintiff's claim is unsupported by the necessary documentation to override the validity of the defendant's deed." The words fell like a hammer, heavy and final. "Mrs. Jones let out a soft gasp, covering her mouth with trembling hands. Mr. Jones's head dropped, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the decision. Damien's face hardened, but he remained professional. "Your Honor, I respectfully request the opportunity to appeal this decision." "You may file your appeal," Thorne said dismissively, already moving on to the next case. As the courtroom emptied, Elena remained seated, her notebook closed but her resolve unwavering. She watched as the Joneses left the courtroom, their heads bowed in defeat, and as Martin Vance shook hands with his client, a victorious smirk on his face. Thorne glanced at her one last time before retreating to his chambers. There was something in her eyes that unnerved him, a quiet certainty, a strength he couldn't place. Elena rose slowly, her footsteps measured as she left the gallery. The next chapter of this trial was just beginning, and she was ready. The corridors of the Franklin County Courthouse hummed with the muffled echoes of hurried footsteps and whispered conversations. Judge Edgar Thorne sat in his chambers, a dimly lit room lined with law books and framed accolades. The heavy oak door was closed, insulating him from the usual bustle outside. He leaned back in his leather chair, absently drumming his fingers on the desk. The case had concluded, but something gnawed at him. His decision to rule in favor of Greenway Investments was routine, logical, at least in his mind. Yet the calm, penetrating gaze of the woman in the gallery lingered in his thoughts. Who was she, and why had her presence unsettled him? Meanwhile, Elena Ramos walked with measured steps down the courthouse hallway, her notebook tucked neatly under her arm. She stopped at a bulletin board where case schedules were posted and scanned the names of the judges assigned to upcoming trials. Thorne's name appeared more than once. She made a mental note, then turned toward the clerk of court's office. Inside, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor sat behind the counter, typing away at a keyboard. "Can I help you?" the clerk asked, barely looking up. "Yes," Elena said, her voice polite but firm. "I need access to Judge Thorne's case history over the last 5 years, specifically rulings on civil property disputes." The clerk paused, finally glancing up. "And you are?" "Elena Ramos," she replied, sliding a folded piece of paper across the counter. The clerk unfolded it, her eyes widening slightly as she read the letterhead, Office of the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. The clerk's demeanor changed instantly. "Of course, Chief Justice Ramos. I'll prepare the files immediately. Will you need hard copies or digital records?" "Both," Elena replied, "and I'd like them expedited." The clerk nodded, already typing faster. "I'll have them ready within the hour." In another part of the courthouse, the Joneses sat on a bench near the exit, their faces etched with despair. Mrs. Jones dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, while her husband stared blankly ahead, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Damian Clark paced in front of them, his frustration barely contained. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low but determined. "We appeal. There are higher courts that will hear your case." Mrs. Jones shook her head weakly. "We don't have the money for an appeal, Damian. This case has already drained everything we have." Damian stopped pacing and crouched down in front of them, his tone softening. "I'll handle it pro bono. I believe in your case, and I won't let Greenway get away with this." Before the Joneses could respond, Elena approached, her presence immediately commanding attention. She offered a gentle smile, her earlier intensity replaced by a quiet empathy. "May I sit?" she asked, gesturing to the empty spot beside Mrs. Jones. The Joneses exchanged a glance before nodding. Elena took her seat, her posture relaxed but attentive. "I know today didn't go the way you hoped," she began, "but you should know that your fight isn't in vain. People are watching, people who care." Mrs. Jones looked at her with tear-filled eyes. "Who are you? Why do you care about us?" Elena hesitated, then smiled. "Just someone who believes in justice." Back in his chambers, Judge Thorne poured himself a glass of water, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had plagued him all day. He sat down at his desk, his gaze drifting to the stack of files waiting to be signed. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Enter," he said gruffly. The door opened to reveal the courthouse administrator, a wiry man with thin hair and an anxious expression. He held a manila folder in his hands, his movements hesitant as he approached the desk. "Your Honor," the administrator began, "we've received a formal inquiry regarding your recent rulings." Thorne's brow furrowed. "An inquiry? From whom?" The administrator hesitated, then handed over the folder. Thorne opened it, his eyes scanning the official letterhead. His jaw tightened as he read the words. "Office of the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Elena Ramos." The letter outlined concerns about potential judicial bias in Thorne's courtroom, citing specific cases where his decisions had disproportionately favored corporate interests over individual plaintiffs. The language was formal but sharp, leaving no doubt about the seriousness of the inquiry. Thorne's face flushed with anger. "What is the meaning of this? Why is the Supreme Court meddling in my court?" The administrator shifted uncomfortably. "It's not just the Supreme Court, Your Honor. Word has spread. There are reporters outside asking questions, and a few advocacy groups have taken an interest in the Jones case." Thorne stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "This is my courtroom," he snapped. "I don't answer to anyone." The administrator gave him a pointed look. "Actually, Your Honor, you do." By the time Thorne left his chambers, the courthouse had become a hive of activity. Reporters crowded the steps outside, their cameras and microphones poised for any soundbite. Inside, whispers of the Supreme Court inquiry spread like wildfire, reaching clerks, attorneys, and even janitorial staff. Thorne avoided the main entrance, slipping out through a side door. He couldn't shake the feeling that his every move was being scrutinized. For the first time in his career, the weight of accountability pressed heavily on his shoulders. That evening, Elena sat in her modest office, surrounded by stacks of files and glowing screens. The records from Judge Thorne's courtroom had been delivered, and she meticulously combed through them, highlighting patterns of bias and procedural irregularities. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from Damian Clark. "Thank you for your support today. The Joneses needed it. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help." Elena typed a quick reply. "Keep fighting for them. The truth has a way of rising to the surface." She leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the framed photo on her desk. It was a picture of her younger self standing in front of the same courthouse where today's events had unfolded. The memory of her own struggles within those walls fueled her resolve. "Justice is coming," she murmured to herself, her voice steady and sure. The morning light seeped through the blinds of Judge Thorne's chambers, casting long, slanted shadows across the desk. The room, usually a haven of control and authority, now felt oppressive. Thorne sat slouched in his chair, his hands folded tightly over a letter bearing the official seal of the United States Supreme Court. The inquiry had gone public, and the courthouse was abuzz with whispers. He rubbed his temples, the weight of scrutiny pressing heavily on him. For the first time in decades, he felt powerless. When Thorne entered the courtroom, the air was different. The usual hush of respect had been replaced by murmurs and darting glances. Lawyers whispered behind their hands. Clerks avoided eye contact. Even the gallery, sparse on most days, was filled with unfamiliar faces, advocacy group representatives, reporters, and community members. Elena Ramos was among them, seated in the same spot as before. Today she wore a charcoal suit with subtle pinstripes, her notebook open but her pen resting idle. She didn't need to write now. The courtroom itself was her evidence. Thorne's gaze lingered on her as he took his seat on the bench. He recognized her now. The revelation had come late the previous evening when his clerk had tentatively informed him who Elena Ramos truly was, Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. The realization had sent a cold chill down his spine. He had dismissed her as an irrelevant observer, someone whose presence in his courtroom he had the authority to control. Now the power dynamic had shifted so drastically it made his head spin. The first case on the docket was a routine procedural matter, a scheduling dispute between two attorneys. Normally, Thorne would have handled it with ease, but today his usual confidence felt like a distant memory. Every word he spoke seemed weighed down by invisible eyes, judging his every move. When he ruled in favor of one attorney, he caught the flicker of a raised eyebrow from Elena. It wasn't a gesture of disapproval, just observation, yet it unnerved him. As the morning cases proceeded, Thorne found himself stumbling over words, second-guessing his rulings. He caught himself glancing at Elena more than once, searching her expression for any sign of approval or condemnation. She gave him neither. Her calm neutrality was far more disarming than any overt criticism could have been. During the lunch recess, Thorne retreated to his chambers, hoping for a moment of peace, but his solitude was short-lived. A soft knock on the door startled him. "Come in," he said curtly. The door opened to reveal Elena Ramos. She stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind her. Thorne rose, his instinct to assert control conflicting with the knowledge of her authority. "Chief Justice Ramos," he said, his voice tight. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Elena smiled faintly. "I thought we could have a conversation, Judge Thorne. Off the record." Thorne gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "Please sit." She did, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly on the armrests. Thorne returned to his chair, feeling suddenly exposed despite being on his own turf. "You've been watching my courtroom for days now," he began, his tone defensive. "Is this part of the inquiry?" "In part," Elena admitted. "But I'm also here because I've seen patterns in your rulings that raise questions. Today's proceedings have only added to my concerns." Thorne's jaw tightened. "I've served this court for 30 years. My record speaks for itself." "Indeed, it does," Elena said evenly. "And that's precisely why I'm here. Patterns of bias don't emerge overnight, Judge Thorne. They build over time, quietly shaping outcomes and eroding public trust." Thorne bristled. "Are you accusing me of bias, Chief Justice? Because if so, I'd like to see the evidence." Elena reached into her leather folder and withdrew several sheets of paper. She laid them on his desk, spreading them out methodically. "These are summaries of your rulings over the last 5 years," she said. "In cases involving corporate entities versus individuals, you've ruled in favor of corporations 89% of the time. When the plaintiffs are from marginalized communities, that percentage rises to 95. Thorne stared at the papers, his face growing red. "Statistics can be manipulated. Those numbers don't prove anything. They're not meant to convict you," Elena said softly. "They're meant to start a conversation. Judge Thorne, this isn't just about one case. It's about the broader implications of your decisions. Every ruling you make impacts lives in ways you may not fully realize." He leaned back in his chair, struggling to maintain his composure. "And what do you suggest I do? Resign? Admit to something I don't believe I'm guilty of?" Elena's gaze softened, but her tone remained firm. "I suggest you reflect, Your Honor. Reflect on the weight of your position and the trust placed in you by the people you serve. You still have an opportunity to correct the course." As Elena rose to leave, Thorne felt a mix of resentment and unease. She paused at the door, turning back to him. "I'll be in the gallery for the rest of the day," she said. "Not as your adversary, but as your witness. What happens next is entirely up to you." With that, she left, leaving Thorne alone with the papers spread across his desk. The silence of the room was deafening. When Thorne returned to the bench that afternoon, he felt the weight of Elena's presence more keenly than ever. She was back in her usual seat, her notebook open once again. The next case involved a tenant facing eviction from a low-income housing unit. The landlord, a well-dressed man with a team of attorneys, argued that the tenant had violated the terms of the lease. The tenant, a single mother, struggled to articulate her defense without legal representation. Thorne glanced at Elena before addressing the courtroom. For the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt, not in the tenant's case, but in himself. Was he truly impartial, or had years of unchecked authority clouded his judgment? As the proceedings unfolded, Thorne found himself asking more questions, demanding clearer evidence from the landlord's attorneys. He allowed the tenant more time to speak, guiding her gently through the process. By the end of the case, he ruled in favor of the tenant, citing insufficient evidence from the landlord. In the gallery, Elena's pen moved across the page, her expression unreadable. As the day ended, Thorne sat in his chambers once more, staring at the papers Elena had left. Her words echoed in his mind. Reflect on the weight of your position. For the first time in his career, Thorne did just that. The gavel he wielded felt heavier now, not just as a symbol of authority, but as a reminder of the lives it touched. The Franklin County Courthouse buzzed with subdued energy the following morning. The air felt different, heavier, as though everyone inside could sense the shift that had begun. Judge Edgar Thorne sat at his bench, the towering figure of authority he had always been, yet today his posture seemed less rigid. There was no gavel strike to begin the day. Instead, he simply adjusted his glasses and nodded toward the bailiff. Call the next case, he said, his voice softer than usual. The day's docket included a high-profile case, a labor dispute between a black employee, Mr. Samuel Davis, and a local logistics company, Sterling Haulage. Davis alleged wrongful termination due to racial discrimination, while the company claimed poor performance as the reason. As the plaintiff's attorney laid out his case, presenting emails and testimonies that hinted at racial bias, Thorne found himself listening more intently than he had in years. Every detail, every piece of evidence, he scrutinized with a new lens. When it was time for the defense to respond, Thorne interrupted their opening statement with a firm but measured question. Do you have documented evidence of Mr. Davis's alleged performance issues? The defense attorney faltered, flipping through his notes. We have general feedback from supervisors, Your Honor. General feedback? Thorne repeated, his tone neutral but probing. Without specifics or formal documentation. The attorney stammered, clearly unprepared for the level of scrutiny. Thorne let the silence hang in the room before gesturing for him to continue. Throughout the hearing, Thorne's demeanor shifted. He asked pointed questions of both sides, ensuring the courtroom felt balanced. He no longer leaned into the arguments of the corporate attorneys as he once had. Instead, he weighed each piece of evidence with care, his focus unwavering. When it came time to issue his ruling, Thorne paused. The courtroom waited, tension thick in the air. After reviewing the evidence, he began, It's clear that Mr. Davis's termination lacks the substantive documentation necessary to justify the company's claims. Furthermore, the emails presented suggest an environment of bias that cannot be ignored. His gavel struck, finalizing his ruling in favor of Davis. A quiet gasp rippled through the gallery. From her seat, Elena Ramos smiled faintly, her pen still in motion. As the courtroom emptied, Thorne remained behind, gathering his thoughts. He knew he couldn't delay the inevitable any longer. Rising from his seat, he walked directly toward Elena Ramos, who was closing her notebook. Chief Justice Ramos, he began, his voice steady but low. May I have a word? Elena looked up, her expression calm. Of course, Judge Thorne. They stepped into the hall, the courthouse bustling around them. Thorne hesitated before speaking. I owe you an apology, he said finally, for dismissing you, for not recognizing who you were, and for ignoring the larger implications of my actions. Elena regarded him for a moment, then nodded. Acknowledgement is the first step, Judge Thorne. The question is, what will you do next? Thorne took a deep breath. I've spent years believing my authority was unshakable. Today, I realized how much I failed the people who came to me for justice. I don't want to be that judge anymore. Elena's gaze softened. Then don't be. Change is possible, even now, but it requires humility and accountability. Thorne nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. Thank you, he said quietly, for holding me accountable. You're welcome, Elena replied. But the real thanks will come from those you serve, if you earn it. In the weeks that followed, Thorne began implementing changes in his courtroom. He reviewed his past rulings, reopened cases where his biases may have played a role, and worked closely with advocacy groups to understand systemic inequities. His decisions became more measured, his demeanor less dismissive. The inquiry into his conduct concluded with a formal reprimand, but it stopped short of recommending his removal. Elena Ramos ensured that Thorne's transformation wasn't ignored, noting his willingness to change as a significant factor. A month had passed since Judge Thorne's courtroom began to shift. The Franklin County Courthouse, once known for its rigid hierarchy and unchecked authority, had become a hub of curiosity and quiet transformation. Word spread through the legal community that Thorne, the judge whose rulings had once seemed set in stone, was now taking an entirely different approach. But not everyone believed in his change. Skepticism hung in the air like a fog, as whispers of his bias and past rulings lingered. The next major case on Thorne's docket was one that would truly test his commitment to change. A class action lawsuit had been filed against a major pharmaceutical company, accused of falsifying clinical trial data and selling a defective medication that disproportionately affected low-income families. The plaintiffs, a group of individuals from different walks of life, sat together in the gallery, their faces a mix of hope and apprehension. Across the room, the corporate attorneys from the pharmaceutical giant radiated confidence, their polished suits and briefcases signaling their readiness to crush the opposition. Thorne entered the courtroom with a calm resolve. He surveyed the room, his gaze briefly meeting Elena Ramos's. She was there, as she often was now, her notebook open on her lap, a silent but constant reminder of the weight of his decisions. The trial began, and the corporate lawyers launched into their well-rehearsed defense, armed with legal jargon and carefully selected studies to back their claims. Thorne listened carefully, asking probing questions at critical moments. When the plaintiff's attorney, a young woman named Andrea Reyes, took the floor, Thorne's focus sharpened. She presented evidence of suppressed data, whistleblower testimonies, and heart-wrenching stories from the plaintiffs who had suffered because of the defective drug. As one plaintiff, an elderly woman named Mrs. Price, tearfully recounted how the medication had worsened her health, Thorne's expression softened. For the first time, he addressed her directly, his tone empathetic. "Mrs. Price," he said, "thank you for sharing your story. I understand how difficult it must be to relive this experience. Your voice matters here." A ripple of surprise passed through the courtroom. This was not the Judge Thorne they were used to. That evening, Thorne sat in his chambers, reviewing the case materials late into the night. The testimonies of the plaintiffs weighed heavily on him, but so did the polished arguments of the defense. For decades, he had leaned on procedure and precedent, but now he was learning to balance those with humanity. A knock at the door broke his concentration. It was Elena Ramos. "Working late again, I see," she said, stepping inside. Thorne gestured to the pile of papers on his desk. "This case, it's not as clear-cut as it seems." Elena tilted her head, studying him. "And yet, the right decision often isn't. It's about more than the evidence on paper. It's about the lives affected by your ruling." Thorne nodded slowly. "I never realized how much I overlooked, how much power I held without truly understanding its impact." "Understanding is the first step," Elena said, her tone soft. "But what you do with that understanding is what defines you." After weeks of deliberation, Thorne returned to the bench to deliver his ruling. The courtroom was packed, the tension palpable. He began with a summary of the case, outlining the evidence presented by both sides. His tone was measured, careful, yet there was an undercurrent of emotion that hadn't been there in his earlier days on the bench. Finally, he reached the conclusion. The evidence provided by the plaintiffs demonstrates a clear pattern of negligence and deceit on the part of the defendant. This court finds in favor of the plaintiffs and orders the defendant to pay restitution and medical costs to all affected parties. The gallery erupted in quiet gasps and murmurs. Mrs. Price's hands flew to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Andrea Reyes grinned in relief, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in weeks. Thorne struck his gavel, his voice steady. "This court is adjourned." As Thorne stepped down from the bench, he noticed Elena standing near the exit. She didn't say anything, but the small nod she gave him spoke volumes. It wasn't praise, it was acknowledgement of the path he was walking, one step at a time. In the weeks that followed, Thorne's rulings began to reflect a deeper sense of fairness and compassion. He reopened old cases, ensuring justice was served where it had been previously denied. He hosted workshops for his peers on recognizing and addressing bias, partnering with Elena Ramos to lead discussions on judicial integrity. One evening, as Thorne locked up his chambers, he found himself walking through the empty courthouse. He stopped in the gallery of courtroom 4B, where it had all begun. The room was silent now, but he could still feel the weight of the moments that had changed him. For the first time in his career, he felt not just like a judge, but like a servant of justice. Injustice may have ruled the courtroom once, but change had taken its seat at the bench. Judge Thorne's journey wasn't just about redemption. It was a reminder that even those with the greatest power must hold themselves accountable. If this story has inspired you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. More stories of transformation, justice, and redemption are coming your way. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. And so, the judge who once believed himself untouchable learned the true weight of justice. His arrogance was replaced by humility, his power tempered by accountability. But this story isn't just about him. It's a reminder that fairness, courage, and integrity can prevail, even in the face of inequality. The story of Judge Thorne is not just about personal redemption. It's a powerful commentary on the responsibility that comes with authority and the impact of unchecked bias. It reminds us that even those in the highest positions of power are not infallible and must constantly hold themselves accountable to the people they serve. At its core, this story reveals the importance of empathy, humility, and the courage to confront one's own mistakes. Judge Thorne's transformation highlights how change is always possible, no matter how deeply rooted the problem may seem. It teaches us that the first step toward justice is recognizing when it has been denied and having the will to correct it. For society, this story is a call to action. It urges us to question the systems we trust, to demand accountability from those in power, and to ensure that fairness and equality are not just ideals but realities. It also emphasizes the role of individuals like Elena Ramos, who stand as unwavering witnesses to injustice and push for meaningful change. Ultimately, the story serves as a beacon of hope, showing that even within flawed systems, there is room for transformation. It challenges us all to reflect on our roles, whether as leaders, advocates, or everyday citizens, in creating a world where justice truly serves all. If you found this story as inspiring as I did, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. There are more stories of justice, redemption, and life-changing twists coming your way. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.